你好, ni hao. Today I'd like to talk about 中国乐器, or Chinese instruments. So that takes us to our first vocabulary word, 乐器, which means musical instrument. Here are the characters and the pinyin for the word. So why study 中国乐器? Well, many modern instruments have been inspired by traditional Chinese ones, and China is one of the earliest civilizations to make music and have musical instruments, so it's pretty cool to take a look at. These early instruments are preserved well because of the strong materials they're made out of, so for that reason they're very easy to study, even though some of them are thousands of years old. And we've not studied much Chinese music as a class, but it's a topic I'm interested in, so I decided to dive deeper into it. So here's an introduction to 中国乐器. China has a wide variety of instruments. These either come from China or from India and Central and West Asia, but the majority of them are from indigenous groups in China. They've been traditionally used in rituals and celebrations, but they're also a sign of wealth in some families. If you have lots of instruments, it's a sign you might be a wealthier family or to show off to other families. The typical materials that are used to make instruments are animal hide, clay, metal, stone, gourds, wood, silk, and bamboo. And these are 8 different materials, main materials, and keep those in mind because we're going to talk more about them later. So if we look back in history, 8,000 years ago, the first instrument discovered, the oldest playable instrument in the world actually, are these flutes made from the wing bones of red-crowned cranes. Here's a picture of the crane, and they are found in the Jiahu in the Henan province in 1986. They're on display in the Henan Provincial Museum in Zhongzhou. They're called Jiahu Gudi, and they have 5 to 8 finger holes, as you can see in this picture here, which is one of the actual flutes on display in the museum. So that's our second vocabulary word, Jiahu Gudi, Jiahu bone flute, and obviously the name makes sense based on their origin. So a little more recently, 3,500 to 2,000 years ago, we started seeing that there were more musical instruments buried in the tombs of Chinese rulers, and some of these instruments included stone chimes called qing, which are still used today. There are clay ocarinas, shun, bronze bells. There are 2 different types. The larger kind that looks more like a modern day bell is ling, and then there were other kinds that are more, either you hold them upside down or they're used more like cymbals, and they're called nao. And there's barrel-shaped drums called gu. Here there were some pictographs on oracle bones, and these actually reference some of these instruments from way before, in the 14th century BC, so that suggests that these instruments were around even before this time period, and this was already a long time ago. And here you can see the image of these stone chimes of the qing on the left, and one of the clay ocarinas, the shun, on the right. If we look at the Zhou dynasty in 1046 to 256 BC, there were bigger musical ensembles with up to 125 instruments, which is a lot of instruments. They had transverse flutes called dizi, mouth organs, which could make several different pitches. You can see a picture of them on the bottom left called sheng, and zithers, which were called guqin. And here's one of the groups. If you look at this photo here, a common group of instruments, a musical group here. And this is kind of described by this wind, bamboo, and string silk instruments idea, which refers to the idea that bamboo and silk were very common instruments, kind of like wind and string instruments in Western cultures. And this had a special word to describe this type of music called siju, which means silk bamboo. And this 8-tone system was developed to divide the instruments into different categories. Ba yin is what the 8-tone system called. Ba, like 8, and tin yin wei, that's where the yin comes from. And these divided the instruments into different categories based on the materials they were made out of. So this is our third vocabulary word, siju, which we talked about, bamboo, silk. And separately, siju means bamboo silk, but it's also used to describe the music, which is a combination of bamboo instruments and silk instruments, or wind and string instruments. A little more recently, during the Han Dynasty, musical instruments were traded along the Silk Road. That's how there was a great influence of different cultures and their instruments on Chinese instruments. For example, oboes and metal trumpets were brought to China from the West, drums and lutes were brought to China from India, and there was an oud-like lute from the Middle East that developed a flat back in China. So typically an oud has a rounded back, but this instrument developed a flat back in China, and for that reason it was called a different name, called a pipa. And here's a picture of a pipa. And then if we look at the Tang Dynasty, Chinese music underwent a major change with more migrations of people from Central Asia into China. Music became very popular in the court of Emperor Xuanzong of the Tang Dynasty, and thousands of people study music at the Imperial Music Academy. Here in the bottom left corner, you can see a picture of some people gathered around a table with musical instruments, and that's the emperor there on the right. So as we've been doing in this class, we've been learning some names also along with vocabulary. So our fourth vocabulary word is actually a name, which is Tang Xuanzong, or Emperor Xuanzong of the Tang Dynasty. And now I just want to highlight bells. These are very important in Chinese music, and bronze bells initially came from the Shang Dynasty and have an upward facing bell on the left there. Those are the now bells I was talking about earlier, but the most common type of bells are these zhong, and these bells are hung from wooden frames, and they were developed in the 10th century. You can see on the right, that's what some of them look like. The largest bell ever found is over 40 inches tall and weighs 488 pounds, which is kind of incredible, but they come in a bunch of different shapes and sizes as the right photo illustrates. And these again are called zhong. That's our fifth and final vocabulary word. Zhong, kind of like zhongguo. Chinese instruments in the modern day. Many traditional Chinese instruments are still utilized today. Chinese orchestras have woodwinds, bowed strings, plucked strings, and percussion instruments, which is somewhat similar to music in the US, but there are much fewer horns than we have traditionally in the United States and in other Western styles. The Chinese music is based on the pentatonic scale, which is 5 tones, versus the heptatonic scale, which is 7 tones in Western music. For those of you who play an instrument, you'd understand that we have 7 tones in our music versus 5 tones traditionally in Chinese music, although this doesn't really apply to newer forms of Chinese music like pop music, for example. So the conclusion is many instruments have developed in China throughout history. They all play an important role in society, and it's important to study them to get a better idea of not only Chinese culture, also the music of China, and how these changes have all shaped the musical instruments that are played and loved today in China. 谢谢。